2 days ago, your wealth manager said it out loud over the phone. Your net worth had just crossed $65 million. Today, you're turning the corn on Tyler's grill. Now someone across the picnic table is asking, half laughing, if you're still driving that grey Corolla from senior year. The group waits for you to look small. Your shoulders stay loose. You say yes, actually, and flip the corn. Nobody standing in this backyard knows what that number is, and after 2 days of knowing it yourself, you already understand you're not the one who's going to tell them. This is real. The number your wealth manager read out is sitting in an account with your name on it, and the corn on that grill is the same corn everyone else is eating. For years now, every time this group gets together, someone finds a new way to place you slightly behind. The car, the job title, the vacation you didn't take. No one here is being cruel. They're just filling in a picture with the only information they have, and the picture is wrong. You used to feel that gap and think about correcting it. You don't anymore, and the reason isn't confidence, and it isn't a secret you're proud of keeping. There's a distinct shift behind that, and it didn't happen the way most people would picture it. No confrontation, no grand reveal. Just a change in what you were willing to let a room believe about you. It's something closer to a decision you made without announcing it, one that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with what you needed other people to see. That's what this is about, what that decision actually was and what it cost to make it. If this sounds like your own group, your own reunion, drop unseen in the comments. The marker for anyone willing to look at what they've let a room assume. Hit subscribe, because this only makes sense after what happened first. The cookout 3 years earlier, when that gap was still new enough to sting. 3 summers ago, this same cookout happened in Wes's backyard because Tyler was still renting a 1-bedroom above a laundromat and didn't have a yard worth mentioning. You remember the exact folding chair you sat in because that was the day Tyler told the table he'd gotten the regional manager job, $41,000 a year, up from $32. He said the number himself, out loud, twice, and the table did what tables do. Someone whistled. Someone raised a can in his direction. You raised yours too. You meant it. Nobody at that table knew that 4 months earlier you'd joined as one of the first engineers at a company none of them had heard of and taken part of your pay in shares instead of cash. A bet you'd made on purpose, on a company you believed in before you had any proof you were right. A stack of paper nobody could spend, so unremarkable you hadn't mentioned it to your own brother. No one asked what you'd been up to. And this is the part that's easy to miss if you weren't the one sitting in that chair. It wasn't that you were hiding something enormous. There was nothing enormous yet. A pile of unvested shares in a company nobody had heard of is not a story. A regional manager title is a story. So when the conversation moved on, it moved on without you in it. Not because anyone excluded you, but because you genuinely didn't have anything that sounded like news. You told yourself that was fine, and mostly it was. What you didn't examine, not that year, was the small thing you did about 10 minutes later, when Wes's cousin asked what you were up to these days, and you said, same as always, nothing new, which was technically true, and also the first time you'd taken a fact about your own life and quietly filed it under things this room doesn't need to know. It didn't feel like a decision. It felt like a shrug. You drove home that night in the same car you'd had since college, past Tyler's old apartment building, and didn't think about the cookout again until the next one. Nobody tells this part when they talk about people like you later. Not the reveal, not the number. The folding chair, the whistle for someone else's raise, and a sentence you said without weighing it, because at the time there was nothing to weigh. That summer, the gap between what the room believed about you and what was quietly true barely existed. Shares you couldn't sell in a company that might fold by Christmas. It would take a few more cookouts and a few more sentences like that one before that gap turned into something you had to actively manage instead of something that simply existed. By the following spring, managing that gap had become something close to a habit, a small mental adjustment you made without noticing you were making it. The cookouts kept happening every few months, rotating houses, and at the spring one, the conversation drifted somewhere it hadn't drifted before. Money, specifically, and what to do with it. Someone had heard about a duplex for sale 2 towns over. Someone else brought up an index fund their cousin swore by. You had more informed opinions than anyone at that table. In fact, because you'd spent the last year watching a company scale from the inside, close enough to see exactly how the money moved, while everyone assumed you were just eating a sandwich alone. By then, a new funding round had marked your shares past 6 figures on paper. a number that lived in a single document you'd signed and filed, invisible to everyone. Tyler, on the other hand, had just closed on that duplex himself 2 weeks before this cookout and spent the first 20 minutes of the afternoon walking people through cap rates and rental comps like a man auditioning for a show about himself. People kept asking him follow-up questions. No one asked if you owned anything at all, because as far as this yard was concerned, you didn't. Nobody turned to you, not out of malice. You could see that clearly even as it happened. But because the conversation had already quietly sorted itself by who seemed like they'd have something useful to add, and you'd been sorted out of that Category 3 cookouts ago, the moment the regional manager story became the only story anyone remembered about that year. Tyler said something about diversifying, and 2 people nodded like he'd said something new. You ate a chip. You thought about correcting him, actually, on one exact point. He had the tax implications backwards. And then you didn't, and that not doing became the second entry in a pattern you hadn't named yet. There's a specific texture to knowing more than the room and saying nothing, and it doesn't look like anything from the outside. It looks like someone quietly eating chips at a cookout. You'd gotten good, without practicing on purpose, at holding 2 different realities at once. The guy who probably wasn't doing that well, and the one whose equity on a cap table was compounding in value faster than anyone at that table would have believed. It wasn't hard to carry both, not in any way you could point to. It was just quiet, in a way that weighed on you a little more each time. That night, alone in the car, you did something that would turn out to matter more than the duplex or the index fund. You started keeping a private, almost embarrassing habit of asking yourself 3 questions whenever a moment like that one stung. Who's actually judging you right now? How long will they remember this specific exchange? And what would you lose, really, by saying something to fix it? The first time you ran through those 3 questions, in a parking lot with the engine still running, the sting didn't disappear, but it got smaller, like a sound turned down instead of removed. You didn't know yet if it would hold up the next time it really mattered. You only knew it worked once, on a Tuesday, and once was enough to try it again. If you've ever sat quietly through a conversation you could have run circles around, comment unseen, not as proof you're right, but as proof you're not the one who needs convincing. That's the version of this that doesn't get shaken by what happens next, when the same table finally puts you in a spot where staying quiet stops being easy. That spot arrived at the 2-year mark, at a party that wasn't even a regular cookout. It was a thing Tyler's girlfriend organized in the backyard with rented string lights, because Tyler had just quit his job to go all in on the rentals full time. He stood on the porch steps with a beer and told the story people love telling about themselves at the exact moment they've earned the right to tell it. How he'd started with the 1 duplex, refinanced into a second, and was betting he could roll it into enough units, fast enough, that going back to a desk would never make sense again. The whole yard clapped. This was the single biggest win anyone in that circle had ever posted, and Tyler knew it. Later, drink in hand, he came and sat next to you on the porch steps, loose enough from the night to be generous, and said, half as a joke and half not, that he was raising a little capital for the next building if you ever wanted in. 50 grand gets you a piece, man, unless you're still saving up for that. It was the kind of line built to be funny at your expense and useful to him at the same time. And it also happened to be the cleanest opening you'd been handed in 2 years to say the true number out loud and watch every face on that porch rearrange itself. You didn't take it. Not because the words weren't there. They were sitting right behind your teeth, fully formed. But because you ran, in about a second and a half, the same 3 questions you'd started asking yourself in that parking lot. Who's actually judging you right now? Tyler, mostly, performing for an audience that wanted a show. How long will they remember this specific exchange? Maybe a week, folded into 100 other nights like it. What would you lose by fixing it? Nothing you could point to. And also the one thing that had made the last 2 years feel like yours instead of a performance for people who'd stopped really watching anyway. You smiled, said something about maybe next year, and reached for another drink. No one at that party clocked it as a decision. It looked exactly like modesty, or shyness. And that resemblance was doing you a favor you hadn't asked for. What you noticed, walking to your car afterward, wasn't relief. It was how easy the whole thing had been. Easier than the parking lot, easier than the duplex conversation. And how a little unnerving that ease was, because it meant this wasn't a muscle you were straining to use anymore. It was becoming the shape of you. There was a version of you that wished just one person on that porch already knew. Not to win anything, just so the weight wasn't only yours to hold. That version stayed silent too. The gap between what that porch believed and what your latest paperwork could confirm had grown into something genuinely large now, wide enough that saying it out loud would have changed the entire physics of your friend group, and you'd just proven to yourself, quietly, that you could stand 2 feet from that opening and not fall into it. What you hadn't proven yet was whether you could keep doing that once it stopped being a single porch step and started being the rest of your life. It did hold up. Not right away. For another few months, the 3 questions still took a half-second of conscious effort, but somewhere around the 1-year mark past that porch, they stopped being something you did and became something that simply happened, faster than you could catch yourself doing it. When someone joked that you must still be splitting rent with 2 roommates, the questions ran themselves before the sentence even finished, and you were already reaching for the next thing on the table before anyone noticed you'd needed to reach for anything at all. The habit had become the kind of quiet you didn't have to work at anymore, and that's a real relief. Not the relief of winning, but of a wound that stopped needing daily attention. At some point in that same stretch of ordinary months, the number crossed 8 figures. You'd been watching that round take shape for months, and the confirmation still landed on a Tuesday afternoon, reading an email at a red light. The round had officially closed, your stake surviving the dilution and crossing into 8 figures on paper. There was no ceremony to it, though. No phone call, no envelope, just a bigger number in a document you'd have deleted if it had belonged to anyone else. You sat with that for a second, and the first thing you wanted, before pride, before relief, was someone to tell. Someone who'd known you since before any of this, who could hear the number and understand what it meant against the version of you they'd built in their heads for years. You went through the group in your mind, one by one, the way you'd scroll contacts after bad news. Except this was the opposite, and you still couldn't land on a single name that wouldn't turn the moment into something you'd have to manage instead of something you'd get to feel. None of this shows up as sadness, and that's exactly why nobody around you would ever guess it's there. The gap between what the group believed and what's actually true had gotten too wide to register as a gap at all anymore, just background noise instead of a live wire. What had quietly gotten larger wasn't the sting. It was the certain shape of the absence next to you at every cookout. The seat where someone who actually knew would sit. You noticed, too, that Tyler had gone quiet in a new way that spring. Not humble quiet, actual quiet, the kind that shows up right after someone says everything's great in a tone that wasn't quite convincing. A tenant had stopped paying. Nothing you were told directly, just a comment dropped and moved past too fast. The way people move past things they don't want followed up on. You didn't ask, but you filed it, the way you'd learned to file everything now, and you wondered, alone with the radio off, whether the version of winning Tyler had built out loud in front of everyone was as solid underneath as it looked from a folding chair. By the time you got home and were standing in your kitchen, the 8 figures still glowing faintly in your head with nobody to show it to, whether that cost was worth, it wasn't a question you were ready to answer. It was easier, for now, to sit with the tenant who'd stopped paying, and the small, unfamiliar crack that had just opened, quietly, in the one part of this whole arrangement you'd always assumed was solid. The crack didn't stay small. By the next gathering, a low-key Labor Day thing at Tyler's own place instead of another rented backyard. His girlfriend wasn't there, and neither were the string lights, and when someone asked, easy and friendly, how the newest building was treating him, Tyler said he'd sold it, actually streamlining the portfolio, and reached for his phone before the sentence had even finished landing. Nobody at that table clocked it as anything other than a smart business move, because that's what it sounded like if you weren't watching his jaw. You knew better. A distressed property doesn't move that fast unless the price took a real haircut to get it gone. You were watching his jaw. You'd gotten good at watching for exactly that kind of tightness, mostly from years of managing your own. Someone else asked him, later, if everything was good with the rentals overall, and he said, yeah, just a cash flow thing, nothing, in a tone people use when a sentence is true, and also doing a lot of work to sound smaller than it is. You recognized the tone. You'd used it yourself on this exact patio more than once. The difference was that his version was covering something that scared him, and yours had never been covering fear. Just information nobody needed yet. Someone turned to you a few minutes later and asked, the way people ask when they've genuinely run out of other things to say, what you'd been up to. You waited, out of habit, for the old shape of that question to land somewhere, for some version of the 3 questions to fire, for a half second of managing to kick in. Nothing fired. There was nothing to manage. You said, "Not much, works good," and it wasn't a performance. It was just an accurate, boring sentence, delivered by someone who didn't need this porch to think anything different about him. That absence was new enough that you noticed it the way you'd notice a sound stopping rather than starting. This is the part that's easy to get wrong from the outside. It wasn't that you'd stopped caring what the group thought, in some numb, hardened way. You still liked these people. You still wanted the cookouts to keep happening. It was that way you stood, really stood, had quietly stopped being a question this yard was capable of answering one way or the other. The group had spent 3 years building a picture of a guy who was fine, steady, maybe a little behind, and you'd let them, and none of that had cost you anything real anymore, because the picture and the truth had finally stopped needing to agree. There was still a cost, and you felt it clearly enough on the ride back that you didn't try to argue yourself out of it. It showed up as a familiar weight. No one in that yard, including the ones you loved, had any idea what your actual life added up to, and there was no version of tonight where you could have fixed that without unraveling 3 years of a very particular kind of peace. You'd made your choice about that trade a long time ago, on a porch step, without announcing it, and tonight had just confirmed you'd keep making it. That felt less like a wound now, and more like the terms of a deal you'd signed. What you didn't know yet, driving past Tyler's old place above the laundromat, was that the terms of that deal were about to get tested one more time, at a number too large to keep filing away quietly. Your wealth manager had already left a voicemail that afternoon about scheduling a call. Nothing urgent sounding, just routine, they said. And you hadn't listened to it yet. Whatever this was going to turn out to be, it wasn't going to stay contained to a screen and a decimal point the way the last one had. Some numbers, once they arrive, need more than an account to hold them. They need a room. Eventually, they need a picnic table. You called back 2 days later, on a Thursday morning with coffee still in your hand, and your wealth manager walked you through it the way they do. Flat, precise, like reading a grocery list. The acquisition had closed. The shares you'd taken in place of a bigger salary 3 years ago had finally converted. Some of it cash, net of the escrow holdback and a tax hit big enough to make you wince. The rest acquire a stock that had just cleared its own lockup. Add it together, and the number that landed in your accounts was final. Your liquid net worth had crossed $65 million. They said it once. You didn't ask them to repeat it, though some part of you wanted to, not because you'd misheard, but because you wanted to feel the shape of it a second time. You said thanks, that's helpful, and hung up, and stood in your kitchen for a while without doing anything in particular. Not crying, not laughing, just standing, the way you might stand after a long flight, adjusting to solid ground. There was a cookout that Saturday. The same rotation, a different yard this time. Tyler's, actually, though smaller than the string-light one, because he'd mentioned, in passing, that hosting at the old place didn't make sense anymore. You went. You brought the $6 bag of ice you always brought. Nobody in that backyard knew that the man carrying it had, 2 days earlier, been handed a number most of them would never see in a lifetime of paychecks combined. You knew it. You'd known it for 2 days, alone, the way you'd known every other number before it, quietly, without an audience, without needing one. Still, setting the ice down on the folding table, something about carrying that number into a yard this familiar left you oddly unsettled. By early afternoon, the group had drifted into the usual rhythm, and Tyler had gone through enough beers to loosen whatever he'd been holding tight since Labor Day. He brought up the buildings again, this time with an edge under the casualness, said something about needing to find a lender who wouldn't blink at him not having a W-2 to show anymore, before rates did something ugly, said it to the group generally, but looked, for half a second, directly at you when he said it. The kind of look that's really a question dressed up as a comment. You didn't answer it. You turned the corn. That's when he said it, loud enough for the table, grinning in the specific way people grin when they need a laugh to land somewhere. Asked if you were still driving that same grey Corolla from senior year. Man, when are you upgrading? A couple of people laughed, an easy laugh that cost nothing. It wasn't cruel, not really. It was Tyler doing what Tyler had always done, taking the one comparison that still worked in his favor and cashing it in a little harder than usual. Because tonight he needed it to. You understood, watching him say it, that this wasn't really about your car. It was about a man standing in his own backyard, 4 days into a stretch of quietly bad news he hadn't told anyone either, reaching for the one thing that still reliably made him feel like he was ahead of somebody. You were the somebody. You'd been the somebody, gladly, for as long as it helped him to have that. The group waited for you to look small. That's what the joke is built to do. Settle you a rung lower, put things back in the order this table's quietly agreed on for years. Your shoulders stayed loose. You said, "Yeah, actually, still driving it," and flipped the corn. And if anyone had been looking closely enough, they'd have seen that the pause before you answered wasn't hesitation. It was the 3 questions, run so fast now they weren't even questions anymore, more like a single reflex with 3 parts fused into one. Not real judgment, won't be remembered, costs you nothing to let it stand. The whole sequence took less time than it took Tyler to finish his sentence. Here's the part that's easy to get backwards if you've never stood exactly where you were standing. The calm wasn't because the number in your account made the joke not sting. Numbers don't do that on their own. Plenty of wealthy people still flinch at exactly this, because the flinch was never about the money. The calm came from somewhere else entirely, somewhere the $65 million only confirmed instead of caused. It came from not needing that backyard anymore, or anyone standing in it, to tell you where you actually stood. Your position wasn't something this joke could touch, because your position had stopped being a thing other people got to assign. Somewhere around a parking lot, 3 summers back, being seen accurately and being secure had quietly stopped needing to be the same requirement, and everything since then. The duplex conversation, the porch step, the Labor Day patio, tonight, had just been you finding out, one comment at a time, that the second thing had never actually needed the first. There's a cost folded into exactly that kind of freedom, and it showed up about 20 minutes later when Tyler, 3 beers past careful, mentioned the refinance again. This time not as a boast, but almost as a question, low enough that only you and one other person heard it, something about whether anyone knew a good rate right now, because his usual guy wasn't picking up. You could have said something. You had, sitting in your own account, more than enough to make his problem stop being a problem, and for one exact second, watching him try to sound casual about something that clearly wasn't, you understood the actual price of the last 3 years. The same quiet that had kept you steady through every joke about your car was the same quiet that meant no one in this yard, including the man who needed help, would ever think to ask you for it, because as far as any of them knew, you didn't have it. You said you'd ask around. You flipped the corn again. And driving home that night, past the same buildings, the same rotation of houses, you found yourself with a new question. Quieter than the one about the joke, and a lot less comfortable. What exactly was the difference between staying unseen on purpose and simply never being findable when it mattered? The honest answer, by the time you pulled into your own driveway, was that the difference mattered more than you wanted it to. Staying unseen on purpose still leaves a door unlocked somewhere. One person, one late-night phone call, one moment you decide the cost isn't worth paying anymore. What scares you isn't the choosing. It's the version where nobody's left who'd think to call. Not because you decided that, but because it just quietly became true about you. You weren't there yet. Somewhere in all of this, the still driving that Corolla joke had quietly stopped being about you at all. It never actually was. It measured a gap that only ever existed in a room working off old information, updated only as often as you let it, which was almost never. You didn't correct it that first summer because there was nothing yet worth correcting. You don't correct it now because the correcting was never really the point. The point, the whole time, was learning to let a room be wrong about you without letting that wrongness decide anything real. That's the actual shift behind everything you've read so far, and it's smaller and less dramatic than a $65 million number makes it sound. Quiet, at this point, isn't something happening to you. It's something you're choosing, with a full accounting of what it costs. The seat at every cookout where someone who really knew you would sit, if you let them, which for now you still don't. You didn't set out to become someone people underestimate. You noticed, one folding chair at a time, that you could, and you kept choosing it long enough that it turned into who you are instead of just something you do. And if your own account looks nothing like this one, keep this part anyway. The number was never the engine here. The room working off old information, the gap you decide not to correct, the pull to prove something to people who stopped really watching years ago. Those are the same at 65 million as they are at nothing in the bank. That's the only reason any of this was ever really about you and not a balance you'll never see. If any part of this sounds like your own group, your own version of being quietly ahead of people who think you're behind, comment unseen one more time. Not to mark what you're hiding this time, but to mark that you've decided, on purpose, when and where that ends. Subscribe, because what happens when someone in that circle needs you to break the silence is a different story entirely. But until then, find the one person who could actually hold this and tell them. Not everyone gets the number. Someone should.